Good morning, dear colleagues. I hope we all feel great in the Hall of Heroes. But still a lot of time ahead. Let me start with sincere thanks to the organizers for inviting me to speak at this year's ECER conference, and of course my thanks to all of you who have come to hear what I have to say. The theme of this conference, as we all know very well, is Charting Way Forward. With a title like that, what can you expect from someone who has been involved in charting the way forward in one or another way for half a century? You will understand that I will be mainly talking about the way forward by reflecting on the road already traveled. But, dear colleagues, there is also a very personal connection behind the title of my presentation, which I must reveal immediately. I was here at this place for the first time 55 years ago. You will probably understand from my continuation that today, when I'm here again on this campus and in this city, I noticed some interesting parallels to that distant time. On the other hand, everything is very, very much different. First of all, I'm much older. Half a century ago, it was the time after the outbreak of the worldwide student revolt, symbolically known as May '68. But it was not known only in France or Germany or elsewhere in the West, as it is generally known, but also, you won't believe, in this part of the world, which was then known as Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So it was the period after the outbreak of the student movement that left many traces in a large part of the world. You certainly know that something similar, but also totally different, is now happening again on this campus and on the streets of the cities in this country. And all this makes me quite sentimental. Posters on the wall of faculties are almost the same as in May '68. For my generation, that distant period formed a special context, a special zeitgeist, in which we discovered the connection between intellectual and political activity, and became aware of the relationship between power in the world and knowledge about the world. We perceived this relationship as a conflictual one. Our critical reflection on the world around us focused mainly on major global issues such as the war in Vietnam, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in '68, the conflicts in the Middle East, and so forth. With these major issues, we looked beyond the borders of the then common state into the world. But alongside these global issues, there were others that we also experienced at home in acute form, like, for example, the contradiction between political rhetoric of the government and social reality on the other side. We discovered problems of social inequality and justice, we asked ourselves questions about possible paths into the future, which we believe will be our future, as well as the fundamental question of freedom of speech and opinion. As students, we could not ignore, of course, the question of education in all this. And so, for the first time, I was confronted with the relationship between the influence of politics on education and the importance that knowledge about education has or should have in this respect. It was a question about the influence of education and education research on political decision-making. And I think this question is also being asked by today's young generation when I was walking around the campus this morning and reading the posters. I must say, I don't read only Latinic, I'm fluent also in Serbian Cyrillic. And hence, my sympathy for the generation 2025. So here we are, a double experience. Regular study, on the one hand, social and political life on the other. This double experience leads us to rediscover an old idea. To live in a better world, governance must be based on rational arguments. However, this cannot be guaranteed without intellectual immersion, without an unbiased search for truth. One could say without academic research. At the same time, governance based on such arguments, rational insights into the world around us, cannot be guaranteed without democracy, which is the political prerequisite for governance based on rational arguments. We can trace this idea back into history, but of course we cannot go into this extensive matter here. We will skip it and focus directly on the period after the mid-20th century, when a new variant of the idea of the coexistence, possible coexistence of political governance and scientific knowledge gradually took shape in this direction. In other words, it is about the emergence and promotion of the social science paradigm that developed as public policy after the Second World War in the West. This paradigm has had a growing influence on the field of education and education policy since 1960s. In short, it is the idea that policies and political strategies must be supported by scientific findings. Modern societies are now confronted with challenges of such immense complexity that their successful management, that is overcoming and regulating challenges as the central task of governance, is no longer possible without a clear insight into the nature of these challenges and an understanding of the processes that trigger them. If we limit ourselves to the present, we can cite the extremely complex issue of climate changes as one of the highlighted examples. But this is only one of the many and pressing challenges that modern democratic societies have to face. We are, of course, interested in another group of challenges, namely those related to education, education research, and education policy. For most of its long history, education generally remained outside the political sphere. It emerged and developed in the spheres of the family, the private and local sphere, as well in smaller, relatively self-contained learned communities. It was only with the Age of Enlightenment at the end of the 18th century, the dawn of modernity, that education became politicum, as the Habsburg Empress Maria Theresa allegedly put it. It became, with other words, a matter of administration, a matter of the state, of politics. With the dawn of the industrial age, however, education also became an extremely important lever of the economy, which further increased the interest of political decision makers in including education in government plans. The great intellectual names of the time, but also of later decades, significantly influenced the design of political strategies in the field of education and science in many places in Europe, whereby these strategies and, above all, their implementation often deviated significantly from the basic ideas of their intellectual initiators. Again, these are details that we cannot go into here, except to emphasize that while prominent intellectuals contributed to the plans for governance in this area, the educational sciences as we know them in modern times had not yet emerged. These developed and consolidated in their modern form only, as we know, after the middle of the last century. We know, for example, what a strong trigger for the development of educational research in the Western world was the so-called Sputnik phenomenon. That is the launch of the first artificial satellite with which the then Soviet Union wanted to prove that it had overtaken the economically, politically, and scientifically dominant power, the USA. The feeling of the West's alleged backwardness in the field of education and science led to sharp increase in investment in this area, the exponential development of educational science began. And today, we are also helping to expand the crown of this trunk. This trend was, I need to stress that, not unique to the capitalist West. Something similar, although on quite different basis, was also happening in the socialist East of that time, and in the other parts of the world, globally. It should be emphasized, however, that the then communist East, as it is generally called today, was far from being a completely homogeneous formation. Socialist Yugoslavia, which we must remember at this place to emphasize some regional and local aspects of our topic, was something very special in this regard. After 1948, the conflict between Yugoslavia and Soviet Union, it radically moved away from Soviet influence, and it also opened to some Western experiences. The absence of Soviet influence, and on the other hand, the greatly different historical background of individual parts of the then Federation of Yugoslavia, especially the different cultural contexts within an ethnically highly heterogeneous country with several different languages, even with 2 different scripts, simply did not allow for a uniformed, centralized educational policy. Therefore, when designing educational strategies, even in that political system, a space opened up sometimes that allowed and enabled a certain degree of pluralization, the confrontation of different views, both professional and political. With these words, I wanted to briefly contribute to the understanding of the historical heritage and the specific context of this place where we are meeting this year. But now, I would like to address something much more general but crucial for our topic. When it comes to the design of education policies and the regulation of problems that arise in education systems, the forms in which specific relationships are established between knowledge and power, between educational research, if you wish, and policy makers, are extremely important, as the actual development or regression of education in a given society largely depends on them. These relationships can be organized in different ways. To simplify, I will summarize these ways and present them in 2 main forms, each of which is internally divided into 2 antagonistic parts. In the first form, political power can either ignore the insights and advice of scholars and subordinate them completely so that they confirm its interests and aspirations. This form is characteristic of totalitarian rule, of course. In the historical perspective, however, alongside this form, which is symbolized by the characteristic of a barbarian dictator, we can also find its antagonistic counterpole. This is the enlightened king. That is, the ruler who acts as if he were also a scholar, a researcher. Let us read a well-known passage from the beginnings of European culture. Until philosophers are kings, or the kings and princesses of this world have the spirit and power of philosophy, and political greatness and wisdom meet in one, cities will never have rest from their ails, nor the human race. Yes, that's the famous quote from Plato's Republic. To put it simply, Plato resolved the tension between power and knowledge by merging the 2 antagonistic discourses. The shortcomings of blind power and impotent wisdom seem to have been overcome in the idea of the philosopher king. Unfortunately, such enlightened kings were an absolute exception in history, if they ever existed at all. But this does not detract from the reputation of Plato's utopia. The question is nevertheless justified. Is merging the discourses of power and knowledge the right way to resolve the fundamental tension between them? The debate about this has dragged on for centuries, and in that time the circumstances that always have an important influence on interpretations have also changed immensely. Among the reactions to Plato's solution we read over there, solution to the antagonism between power and knowledge, Immanuel Kant, 2000 years later, response is worth mentioning. He countered Plato's understanding with a completely opposite ones. as we can read here, that kings should philosophize or philosophers become kings is not to be expected, but neither is it to be desired. However, it is absolutely indispensable that both kings and sovereign nations, monarchies or republics, if you wish, should not allow the class of philosophers to disappear, nor forbid the expression of their opinions. I must interrupt and say that walking to the campus this morning, I read in Serbian on the Faculty of Arts, nije filozofski čutati, tako nešto. It's not philosophical to shut up. Indeed. Colleagues, we must speak up, we must speak loudly, not in the Hall of Heroes. To become heroes, you need to speak outside on the streets. These are words written at the height of the Enlightenment, in the era of the rise of rational thought and science. Kant recognizes the discourses of power and knowledge as two discourses that are so different that they cannot be expected to match. On the other hand, they are not so irreconcilably antagonistic that there could not be some kind of cooperation between them, but only on the condition that political power is enlightened. For the political power that the Enlightenment presupposes, it is absolutely indispensable not to forbid the expression of opinion by scholars, not to forbid the expression of free mind. This should not be understood as the exclusive privilege of the philosophers, the scholars, but as a necessary condition for the construction of a new kind of civilization, the enlightened age, as Kant would say. Let us now turn to the second form of articulation of the relationship between kings and philosophers, the one that is not possible under totalitarian rule, because it presupposes an open society and a separation of powers. We have read in Kant that it is neither to be expected nor desired the two opposite discourses to merge into a single discourse, since there is a kind of elementary antagonism between them. In this second form of the relationship between scientists and political makers, a more or less balanced cooperation between them can therefore be established. Enlightened governance leading to the rise of a new phase of civilization is not possible without relying on an ever-widening body of knowledge, and the development of science cannot be expected without systematic state support for scientific communities and institutions. But such cooperation can also be problematic. We are not in heavens yet. Enlightened political authorities are aware that they must carefully consider the findings and advice of scientists when making their decisions. However, these findings are often different or even contradictory, and the advice from scholars can be problematic for the government's aspiration and political programs. Therefore, policymakers accept them only selectively or not at all, often arguing that these recommendations are utopian given the real power relations in a particular political space. On the other hand, researchers, scientists, through their research, provide political decision-making bodies with necessary and desirable data, analysis, findings, not least because they must provide a material basis for their actions, isn't it? But at the same time, they maintain a critical distance from them because the political pragmatism that decision makers obviously cannot avoid is incompatible with the principled conclusions that logically follow from research findings, regardless of the heated polemics between different research groups, different research paradigms. If we look back at the development of modern educational research over more than half a century in democratic systems, we can say on a general level that in the first phase of its development, the decision-making forums more or less left the scientific forums to do their work and inform them of their results, findings over which they, policymakers, retained the right to selectivity and their own judgment. Just as the discourse of power and the discourse of knowledge are different, political and scientific judgments are also different. The discourse of power operates under completely different conditions than the discourse of knowledge. And this fundamental difference can neither be ignored nor cancelled out. In a democratic forums, in a democratic environment, this in itself should not be a major problem, but the political selectivity of scientific findings and recommendations can become a problem in certain circumstances. In the limited time available, I am again generalizing when I say that the various paradigms and theoretical methods used by the scientific communities can either fit well with the political agendas and aspirations of governments or conflict with them. This raises the possibility that the right to selectivity that the supposedly enlightened ruler has can reverse his relationship with scholars back to the first form already discussed. He can either simply ignore some advice or make some scholars adapt their advice to his endeavors. Yet there are tensions not only between kings and philosophers, but also between philosophers themselves. We have also been able to observe this in the academic discussion of recent decades. The establishment of education research, whether in the tradition of the continental pedagogic or British and American education studies, was so turbulent, not least because it was located at the interface of various competing academic disciplines with specific interests. Richard Peters, the doyen of British education studies, had ample reason to characterize the early phase of their development as undifferentiated mush. It was 1970s. The antagonism in this field of research can be well illustrated by the controversy that arose at the end of last century with the concept of evidence-based education. David Hargreaves, one of the initiators of this approach, was so fascinated by the effectiveness of evidence-based practice in medicine that he tried to apply it to the field of education, which allegedly showed every sign of inefficiency. However, the accusation of inefficiency in educational research, in education in general, first emerged in political bodies faced with the growing demand for education resources and ever tighter state budgets. The issue of efficiency, therefore, came to the fore and overshadowed all other educational issues, such as the question of the aims and purposes of education. Hargreaves writes that teachers and doctors are pragmatic professionals. They are primarily interested in what works, in what circumstances, and only secondarily in why it works. Therefore, pragmatism is not only a feature of the discourse of power, but is also located in the discourse of knowledge. Of course, it did not take long for critical reactions from opposing scholarly circles to follow. John Eliot, for example, put the following argument: economic ends, such as providing jobs for students and increasing the productivity of the community, are goods that are extrinsic to education and would therefore be better described as purposes and not aims of education. Similar thoughts can also be found in Gert Biesta, who takes the criticism of the concept of evidence-based education to further consequences when he argues why the principle of what works will not work in the field of education. The idea of effectiveness on which this principle is based is an instrumental value, but education cannot be understood and justified as a purely instrumental value. Evidence-based practice entails a technological model of professional action, he says, that can be applied in a field such as medicine. However, if one tries to transfer this model to the field of education, problems arise. And the first one is the role of causality. Being a student is not an illness, just as teaching is not a cure. This is the most important argument, Biesta says, against the idea that education is a causal process. On the contrary, education is not a process of physical interaction, but a process of symbolic or symbolically mediated interaction. In the field of education, means and ends are not linked in a technological or external way, but they are related internally. What is needed, in other words, is an acknowledgement of the fact that education is a moral practice rather than a technical or technological one. Biesta draws also on the distinction between the technical and the cultural role of research as developed by Gerard de Vries. In the first role, the researcher is a producer of means, strategies, and techniques to achieve given ends, while in the second role, he or she provides a different way of understanding and imagining social reality. Such a distinction makes it possible to see that the provision of instrumental knowledge is not the only way in which educational research can inform and be beneficial for educational practice. Evidence-based research assumes a technical role, and its fundamental problem is that it simply overlooks the cultural option. It focuses on the production of means for given ends, and it only has a technological expectation about research. However, this is not an argument in favor of rejecting the technical model of professional activity. Not at all. This would be an oversimplification, according to Biesta, and is no less damaging than the technical rejection of the cultural model. This distinction is important above all because it raises the question of the relationship between research and democracy, which we cannot expect from research in its technical role. Biesta emphasizes de Vries's view that a democratic society is a society in which social research is not restricted to a technical role, but can also perform a cultural role. I think this highlights are very important for our topic. The discussions about education research, which gradually expanded in the second half of the last century, led to a polarization that can be generalized to a certain extent as an antagonism between the technical and the cultural, or humanistic paradigm, if you wish. In the background of these discussions is also the open question of whether the increasingly emphasized social impact of research should only be sought in the provision of decision makers and practitioners with the so-called useful advice, technically useful advice, or whether this impact perhaps lies on a different horizon. Elizabeth Atkinson answered these questions a quarter of a century ago when she wrote, among others, "The research community in a democracy must exist to discuss, not to dictate, and the role of the researcher should be that of public intellectual, not servant of the state." Next one. We live half a century after these discussions began. But at first glance, it seemed that these issues and the broader context of our time have not changed significantly. Today, Ukraine instead of Czechoslovakia, Gaza instead of Vietnam. But, and this is good news, grandchildren instead of grandparents on the street protests. And yet, this is a fundamentally changed world that requires a new critical reflection. Liberal and progressive ideas and policies, which we can trace back to the Age of Enlightenment, and which aim to strengthen an open society, protect equal rights, and realize the aspirations of groups previously marginalized in society, are now facing an illiberal offensive worldwide. This is by no means just a political issue that is remote and irrelevant to the field of education. On the contrary, I believe that it makes a huge change in the zeitgeist that also affects fundamental issues of education and educational research. The pressure on education as a space for the development of freedom is visible, be it through ideological pressure on curricula or through the withdrawal of public funds from institutions. Authoritarian interventions in education are increasingly reinforcing its instrumental dimension by exploiting the potential of modern technology. The new authoritarianism pushes research into its technical role. And we are therefore faced with the need to rehabilitate the humanities and the cultural role of research, including in the field of education, or particularly in this field. I would like to conclude with a few more thoughts on this. The challenges of authoritarianism that harnesses modern technology, however new and threatening they may seem today, are not entirely new. We can read in the extensive literature that the role of humanist thought in the technological age has been diminishing for practically the whole of the last 100 or maybe even 200 years. That is, during the period in which the development of technical means has been exponential. Just one example. Max Horkheimer expresses this in the introduction to his The Eclipse of Reason, published actually, 47, in a form that is also astonishingly topical for our time. It seems, he says, that even as technical knowledge expands the horizon of man's thought and activity, his autonomy as an individual, his ability to resist the growing apparatus of mass manipulation, his power of imagination, his independent judgment appear to be reduced. When we talk about the role of the humanities, in particular in education, we cannot ignore the concept of enlightenment. And when we talk about Horkheimer, we cannot ignore the concept of dialectic of enlightenment developed together with Adorno, also just after the Second World War, as one of the supporting concepts that help us to think about why the Enlightenment has disappointed. Today, the question is whether or how and revitalized. In this respect, we should not fall into a possible romanticism, namely blaming the technical means and rejecting technology in general. Horkheimer, namely, speaks of the technical means of enlightenment. The process of dehumanization does not come from them, from technical means, since they contain the potency of enlightenment. They came from the human use, or better, abuse, misuse of these means. The process of dehumanization thus has a human and not an external cause, and its cultural role, therefore, be a particularly privileged topic of research. The counter-concept to dehumanization is humanization. Education as conscious, even institutionalized activity that is geared towards the formation of free individual is constantly confronted with this dichotomy. Throughout cultural history, people have been concerned with the conceptualization of humanization, that is, transition from nature to culture, both phylogenetically and ontogenetically. A well-known mythological solution to this problem is offered by the figure of Prometheus, who has generally been perceived so far as the protector of humanity. But let us ask ourselves, can this myth really only be understood, only be interpreted in this way? Or is it possible that Prometheus actually made a tragic mistake by, metaphorically saying, stealing fire, the technological force, which was supposed to humanize our race? Once again, we return to Plato and conclude, this time to his provocative interpretation of this myth, which portrays Prometheus, I would like to say, as a negative hero. We read in his dialogue Protagoras that by stealing fire from gods and giving it to us, humankind had a wisdom about the means of living, but it did not have wisdom about policraft, wisdom of coexistence in society, we say today. Plato continues, and while their technical skill was a sufficient help to them for food, they did not yet have a skill of policraft. They kept on seeking to save themselves by building polis. And so, when they were gathered, they were acting unjustly toward one another because they didn't have the skill that concerns the affairs of the polis. Prometheus thus created a problem that he could not solve. He gave people the technical means to enlighten themselves, but left them unenlightened. They mastered nature, but they did not be able to master human affairs, culture. Therefore, according to Plato, a supreme authority had to appear on the scene. And we read, and so Zeus, fearing for our genus, sends Hermes to bring reverential fear and a sense of what is legally just, so that there might be both ordering principles of policy and the bonds that bring about friendship. One could thus speak of the dialectic of Prometheanism as a kind of variant of dialectic of enlightenment, the noble intention to save humanity with fire and technical means stolen from the gods, an attempt at divine incarnation, divine humanization, has been transformed into dehumanization. Behind this metaphor lies the question of how the relationship between means and ends, between instrumental and teleological reason, can be harmonized. This seemingly abstract task is still of great importance in the field of education today. To put it simply, are smartphones in school a blessing or a threat? Since the institutionalization of education in the age of enlightenment, we have been confronted with a tension, even contradiction, between the conceptualizations of education and its social and political realizations. On the one hand, the problem of the school as an ideological state apparatus has emerged time and again, while on the other hand, the problem of the vocationalization of education has increasingly arisen in the modern age. The fundamental purpose of education in the technological age is to prepare, train, adapt the individual for a useful, profitable activity based on highly developed technical means that achieve the imaginary power of the gods from ancient myths. How one does something, how it works, becomes a more important question than how one thinks about why one may or may not do something. Today, this process is increasingly mediated and reinforced by technical means. So, the question for Zeus would be whether and how it would be possible to strengthen the potency of technological means as a means of enlightenment. I think that this is not just an abstract philosophical question, but also a question that concerns education and education research. How to make smartphones being means of enlightenment. The question of what works is only legitimate if it is accompanied by the question of why it works and whether it really works. To conclude, briefly, fire is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. Without a reverential fear and a sense of what is legally just, if I use Plato's words, all that remains is a burned-out place. This is one of the key messages that researchers, I think, need to be aware today and convey to decision makers and politicians. Thank you very much.